Our story begins with the Spirit of God hovering over the water of an already partially completed earth, using beautiful and glorious poetic language. This is poetry. This isn't science. I know this is heresy for many believers, but you are no more required to figure out the date of the creation of the world from Genesis than you are to figure out how many lumens Juliet's eyes produce by reading Shakespeare's balcony scene. God formed the earth, and it is enough to know that, like Romeo looking at Juliet, God saw that it was good. Things did not stay good for long, however. Adam and Eve trusted a snake over their God and began a slow descent from perfection. First, they lost their relationship with God, then they lost the Garden of Eden, and finally they lost their son. People began to multiply on the earth, and things spiraled out of control so quickly that God regretted ever having made humanity and decided to destroy them once and for all. Only Noah and his family were saved as God directed them to create a large boat that would house them and the animals that God brought to them and keep them safe for the flood. Noah's story is not unique, though. From the same Mesopotamian area, several other boat-building, animal-saving, flood-related myths show up. In fact, nearly every major city of Mesopotamia has evidence of catastrophic flood damage at some time in its history. However, they all seem to happen at different times and be localized catastrophes. Depending on how we interpret the word earth in this passage, Noah's flood might have been one of these localized catastrophes that wiped out a specific civilization. Regardless, the flood was only a brief respite from evil, and the next time we see people, their civilization has advanced, but their relationship with God has gone backwards. They built a tower as a celebration of themselves, and God scattered them and scattered their languages. Now, this tower was probably a ziggurat, perhaps even the great ziggurat of Ur itself, which was finished by King Shulgi, a man who proclaimed himself to be a god. Less than 100 years after that ziggurat was finished, Ur and nearly every other city in the Middle East would collapse under rather mysterious circumstances. Just escaping from this chaos of the region came Abraham and his family, who God had led out of the city of Ur just before it collapsed, right around the year 2000 BCE. God made a treaty with Abraham and promised Abraham the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, called Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine, as an inheritance to his descendants, if Abraham and his descendants would continue to follow God. During a long and troubling wait for Abraham's first descendant, he would father a son on a slave girl who would grow up to become the spiritual ancestor of Islam. Finally, in his old age, Abraham and his wife Sarah had a son, and they named him Isaac. Abraham would live nomadically the entire time he was in Canaan, but he would live as near equals with the city dwellers because of that near universal collapse that had happened recently. Isaac carried on the tradition of following God, but imperfectly, and he had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob was second born, but he was a schemer. He schemed for his father's blessing, he schemed for his birthright, and he schemed to pay off his wives. Pay off his wives. Between his two wives and two of their slaves, Jacob, who was renamed Israel after a night of wrestling with God, became the father of 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. One of Jacob's youngest sons, Joseph, was loved by his father but hated by his brothers so much that they sold him into slavery, where he ended up eventually rotting in an Egyptian jail. When Joseph finally emerged from prison, having interpreted Pharaoh's dreams as that there would be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of bad famine, he emerged as the second most powerful man in Egypt behind Pharaoh himself, in charge of making sure that Egypt survived that famine. Now, this is strange because at that time, the Egyptians were incredibly xenophobic and hated having any foreigners in positions of power anywhere. There are also no written records of Joseph in Egypt, which is also strange because the Egyptians generally kept very good records. One solution to all of these problems involved the Hyksos. The Hyksos were invaders of Egypt who conquered it, and while they took Egyptian titles, Egyptian land, Egyptian roles, they retained some very different customs. One of which was welcoming in foreigners to a position of government. Few records also exist from this period because the Egyptians destroyed them when they finally kicked the Hyksos out. If the Hyksos took over while Joseph was in jail, that might explain why he was in jail for so long, as well as why some of Pharaoh's household ended up in jail with him. It would also explain why he became part of government and why there are no records of him. In this theory, Joseph helped consolidate the Hyksos rule on the land by giving them food security during this famine, and by bringing all land under government control as people paid for grain with whatever they had. Eventually, the famine led to Joseph being reunited with his entire family, and everyone moved to the center of Hyksos power in the Nile Delta. The Hyksos were eventually expelled from Egypt sometime in the mid-1500s BCE, and a new pharaoh came to power who neither knew Joseph nor trusted his descendants. From this point on, all foreigners were expelled from Egypt or enslaved, and this included the people of God, who had stayed a little bit too long in the comforts of Egypt. The people remained slaves in Egypt until the time of Moses, a Hebrew raised by Egyptians who fled into the desert because he had committed murder. There in the desert, Moses found a wife and a purpose. He encountered the God of his ancestors in a burning bush out in the desert. Apparently, Moses and pretty much all of the Israelites had forgotten who their ancestral God was and had to be reintroduced to the God named I Am. This God assigned Moses the task of convincing Pharaoh to free the people of Israel. Moses didn't really want to, but eventually agreed, and in a series of slowly escalating miracles, each of which seems to be targeted at a specific Egyptian god's realm of power, he attempted to convince Pharaoh to release the people. This finally succeeded with the night that became known as Passover, where death visited all of the firstborn of Egypt, only passing over those houses whose doorposts had been marked by the blood of goats. This understandably got Pharaoh's attention, and the Hebrews were allowed to leave along with a host of other slaves who went with them. Pharaoh quickly changed his mind, but owing to the miraculous midnight crossing of the water, the Hebrews escaped safely into the desert of Sinai. After several months, the people arrived at Mount Sinai, where God renewed his covenant agreement with the people and laid out a series of laws and commands that were the stipulations of that covenant agreement. And these laws are actually quite similar to the laws laid down by the Babylonian king Hammurabi several hundred years earlier. Now, we know all of this, but the dating of it is actually quite a pain in the rear end, because pretty much everybody has their own system of dating it, but no theory fits all of the facts that we have, unfortunately. The most appealing notion is that the Exodus took place during the transition of power between the pharaohs Seti I and Ramses II, somewhere around the year 1280 BCE. For several hundred years up until that point, the Promised Land had been ruled over and fought over by the two major superpowers of the day, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire. Before 1280, the people of God might have escaped Israel, but they would have had no place to go. The land that they were promised was still controlled by a very powerful nation. Now, this all changed in 1274 with the Battle of Kadesh. The Hittite and the Egyptian armies met in one of the largest battles of the ancient world that resulted in pretty much a stalemate. Both sides were so badly beaten that they had to retreat back within their borders. Then, just when both empires were starting to recover, they were attacked by invaders from the sea. These same sea people also attacked the natives of Canaan, who had started to rebuild after now being free from the rulers that they'd had for several hundred years. These sea invaders took several cities and became known in the Bible as the Philistines. Now, if the Exodus happened around 1280, then all of these battles and all of these armies passing by happened while the people of God were in the desert learning what it meant to follow God and trust God. Even as they complained time and time again, the most hotly contested area in the world was becoming free for their conquest. And conquer they did. Under their new leader Joshua, the conquest of Canaan started east of the Jordan and then came west, with their first big test being the city of Jericho. Now, historical data shows that the walls of Jericho were already crumbling and decaying at that time, that they were more show than anything else, but still would have been a very big morale booster for these unexperienced conquerors. The people of Israel eventually conquered most of the land that they had been promised. However, as soon as they got their land, they fragmented back into their individual tribes. And then the people on the fringes, especially the Philistines, people that Israel hadn't been able to drive out, began to come in and oppress individual tribes very badly for decades at a time. Each time, God would raise up a leader, called a judge, who would band together the people, drive off the invaders, and lead the people for a little bit. This kept happening for about 200 years until the prophet Samuel. At that time, the people were complaining because they're the only nation that didn't have a king. Samuel eventually agreed to their demands, and he anointed as king the biggest, toughest man he could find, a man named Saul. This turned out to be a complete disaster. The Philistines were defeated, true, but only because a tiny little man named David had faith in God. Saul just ended up throwing spears and temper tantrums. Finally, Saul died in battle along with his son, and that tiny little man named David became king, somewhere around the year 1000 BCE. It should be noted that a good portion of the Philistines' success over all of the local people, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Israelites, was because they were the only people in the area who had mastered iron. The Israelites were still using bronze weapons and were being cut down like wheat. Part of the appeal of David as king was that he had lived among the Philistines and theoretically had access to this technology. This was huge. It would be like electing for president someone who knew how to make photon torpedoes and phasers. David was a warrior poet, and a faithful one, to God at least. He was less successful being faithful to his growing collection of wives. The most famous example was with a woman named Bathsheba, who he slept with and then had her husband murdered to cover it up. This chaotic family life continued with several of his other children, two of whom tried to murder David and take his throne. Eventually, though, in David's old age, Bathsheba's second son with David, Solomon, ended up taking the throne. The territory that Solomon had inherited from his father was the largest that Israel would ever have. Through his many marriages, Solomon cemented alliances with almost every single major group in the surrounding area, which enabled peace, prosperity, and time to build the temple of God. But it also brought trouble. Those many wives of his led him away from God, and his many building projects required him to heavily tax his people and even use many of them as slave labor in building them, which turned his people against him. When Solomon finally died, a one-time rebel named Jeroboam came to Solomon's heir, Rehoboam. Jeroboam asked if the tax and labor requirements that the people hated so much could be lifted. A simple, sure thing, and the kingdom would have been fine. Instead, Rehoboam took some of the worst advice in history and denied the request, making a really crude joke about his father's penis being the size of his small finger in the process. Yeah, classy guy. Quite naturally, the people decided they didn't want this lunatic ruling them, and in 922, the kingdom of Israel was split in half for good. Jeroboam took his tribe, Ephraim, and the majority of the other tribes and created the kingdom of Israel to the north. Rehoboam took the tribe of Judah and a few other tiny ones and created the kingdom of Judah to the south. Because the temple of God was in the south, most of the Levites and priests headed for the kingdom of Judah, and the Israelite kings were worried that their people would rebel against them and head south as well, so they set up rival shrines on various hills in the northern kingdom as well, to try and keep people from heading to Judah to worship. This set up an odd merger between paganism and cultic worship of the Lord, which would kind of define Israel for the rest of their time. In general, Israel was known for prosperity and strength because of their increased population, while Judah to the south was known for their piety and their relationship with God. As the cycle of kings began in both kingdoms, it started to look very much like the time of the judges again. While the people had a leader and their king, that leader often didn't follow God. So God would raise up spiritual leaders for the community whenever that was necessary, something that became increasingly necessary in both kingdoms as time went on. Now, these spiritual leaders were called prophets, but don't start thinking that their major job was foretelling the future. It wasn't. A prophet was primarily about interpreting the day's events through the eyes of God. Most of what the prophets said was commentary on what was going on around them, and then a little bit of foretelling of what God would do about that in the future. And the prophets saw a lot. They saw laws being broken in favor of rich men and powerful men. They saw people relying on themselves instead of God. They saw the poor being trampled. They saw widows and orphans being neglected. And so the prophets called all of this out, said it was wrong, said God hated it, and said that God was going to punish because of it. And they were generally ignored. Assyria under Tiglath-Pileser III was rising out in the east, and in 743 he invaded and made both Judah and Israel his vassals. After a series of failed revolts by Israel, Assyria finally lost patience, and they started deporting the people of Israel to other parts of their nation. Their capital, Samaria, was destroyed, and the Israelite people disappeared off the face of the map, becoming the 10 lost tribes. Judah, on the other hand, accepted being an Assyrian vassal fairly calmly until Hezekiah took over. At this time, both Egypt and Babylon were throwing off Assyrian rule as well, so the time seemed ripe both for religious reform and for civil revolt, and Hezekiah did both. Assyria, however, after a few false starts, showed up on Hezekiah's doorstep and came down hard. Multiple cities were destroyed, and Hezekiah himself was trapped in the city of Jerusalem. Judah accepted Assyrian rule for a little while after that, but by the time King Josiah came to the throne, Assyria was weakening quite badly. Constant revolts were taking its toll, and Josiah, like his grandfather, thought that religious reform and civil revolt were the solution, that the time was ripe. And it worked too. Assyria was too weak to stop them, and for a very short time, Judah was free. But by 610, Josiah was dead, having been killed in battle, and Egypt was now ruling Judah. As for Assyria, it was completely destroyed, and its territory had been split between the Medes in the north and the Babylonians in the south. Soon, Babylon decided that they wanted what Egypt controlled and came marching south toward Judah, one of Egypt's vassals. Judah was conquered in 597, and while they revolted 10 years later, they were crushed, and the best and the brightest of the land were again taken into exile to Babylon. The spot where they were taken was actually very close to the ancient city of Ur, where God had called Abraham and his family out of. In a very real sense, when the people of God stopped following the covenant agreement, God picked them up from the promised land and dropped them back where God had found them. There they were to stay for over a generation until they had learned to trust God again, much like their ancestors had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until they learned the same thing. While Judah was in exile, yet another power was rising in the east, the Persians under Darius I. They had already conquered the Medes and very soon were looking greedily at the Babylonians. Normally, wars of this sort would involve sieges that lasted years at the city gates, devastation of the surrounding countryside, and death to pretty much anyone who was caught outside of the city were expected in this sort of a situation. But that's not what happened this time. In the middle of the night, the Persians dammed up the river Euphrates, which flowed through the city of Babylon, and just walked into the city through where the river was, entering the palace silently in the middle of the night and then killing everyone there. The kingdom was conquered with barely a drop of blood being spilt outside of the palace. The entire city and all of the walls and all of the people were still intact, including the people of Judah. Side tangent, this is probably the exact same festival where the Babylonian king saw writing appear on the wall and asked Daniel to interpret it for him. After the conquest of the Babylonian Empire, something truly amazing in ancient history happened. The next year, in 538, King Darius issued a decree allowing all of the people who had been in exile to return home if they wanted, and even promising the people of Israel money from the official government funds to rebuild the temple. People being allowed to return home from exile like this had never happened before, and some Hebrews jumped at the chance. Soon, though, the money didn't show up, progress stalled, morale dipped quite dangerously low. The situation continued poorly for the people back in the homeland of Judah for about 100 years. Until finally, Nehemiah, a Jew who was also the Persian emperor's cupbearer at the time, managed to convince the emperor to let him go back with funds to rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Together with Ezra the priest, Nehemiah rebuilt the city and the hopes of the people. reminding them of their covenant with God and rebuilding their practices of faith. There the Old Testament leaves us. The people had returned, but they were vassals of the Persian Empire. The people still waited for their king to return and for true freedom, lasting freedom, to be brought to them again. But we still have several hundred years until Jesus arrives with the New Testament. And we'll tackle that in another video. But until then, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.